You will care, because you're going to help him.
I laughed, but before I could shut the door, my mother's voice rang out sharp and desperate.
He's dying, Kate. Unfortunately, he got involved with drugs and got addicted. His heart and lungs are failing.
I hesitated, not because I cared about Damien, but because I was shocked. Damien had become a drug addict? Wow. And why exactly do you think that's my problem?
You really are ungrateful. After everything we did for you.
Did for me? You mean kicking me out? Mocking me for years? Calling my son an imbecile? You mean that? My mother waved her hand dismissively, as if brushing away my words.
Enough of your self-pity, Kate. Damien needs a heart and lungs.
Then get him a donor. Why are you telling me? What does that have to do with me? Do I look like a doctor to you? In case you both forget, you refused to send me to college.
Are you done yapping? Anyway, it has to do with your son, not you. Don't let yourself feel all special.
Let's be honest, Kate. That boy will never be normal. He'll never have a real life. He can't function properly, and he'll always be a burden on you, and he's your brother. You should be willing to make the sacrifice.
Sacrifice? What are you talking about?
We need Noah's heart and lungs. Sacrifice your son for our son, for your brother.
I felt so disgusted immediately. They weren't asking. They were demanding. Growing up in my parents' house was like living in someone else's shadow. And that shadow happened to be Damien's, my elder brother. He was their golden boy, their pride and joy, the son who could do no wrong. I, on the other hand, was just there. If Damien wanted something, he got it. If I needed something, I was being greedy and unwise to see that things weren't rosy. When he failed in school, they blamed the teachers. When I got top grades, they barely even cared. All I would get was a nod or be ignored. The rules bent and broke for him, while I was punished for the smallest mistake. I learned young that I wasn't wanted. By the time I turned 16, my parents started pushing the idea that I should find a husband soon. Not for my own happiness, of course. They just didn't want the burden of raising a daughter. I wasn't an investment to them like Damien was. Their future lawyer, as they'd say. I was just another mouth to feed. It became unbearable when I turned 18. They told me I needed to move out, get married, find a job, do anything that would take me off their hands. They didn't say the same to Damien, of course. He was their future. He had all the time in the world to figure things out, while I was just excess baggage. I didn't argue. I knew there was no point. So I finally left when I was 21. I married the first man who treated me with kindness. Alex. He wasn't rich, but he was good to me. And that was more than I ever had at home. I thought, maybe, for the first time in my life, I could be happy. But my parents never left me alone. They didn't check in on me, didn't care if I was struggling, until they found out I wasn't pregnant right away. That was when they suddenly had something to say. They started calling me regularly, only to ask silly questions.
What's wrong with you? You've been married for a year and still nothing?
Are you barren or something?
They laughed like it was a joke, but I knew the truth behind their words. In their eyes, I was failing at the one thing a woman was supposed to do, which was to provide children. Damien, of course, had already gotten into law school. My parents' shoulders were so high whenever they boasted about it. Meanwhile, I was being mocked, belittled, treated like I was broken because I hadn't had a child yet. It hurt more than I wanted to admit. Every family gathering I managed to attend turned into the same conversation. My mother would sigh and shake her head dramatically whenever someone mentioned babies. My father would pat Alex on the shoulder and tell him it wasn't too late to find a real wife. Damien, smug as ever, would smirk and make some crude joke about how I must not be trying hard enough. I stopped going to family gatherings. Alex told me to ignore them, but how could I? They had spent my entire life making me feel worthless, and now they had found a new reason to do it. Then, one day, everything changed. After 3 years of marriage, I finally got pregnant. Pregnancy was supposed to be a beautiful journey, but for me, it was filled with anxiety. Not because I doubted my ability to be a mother, but because I knew my parents were watching, waiting for any reason to tear me down. When I gave birth to my son, Noah, I felt pure, unconditional love. He was perfect in my eyes, with his tiny fingers wrapping around mine. I promised, right then and there, that I would be everything to him that my parents had never been to me. But life had its own plans. As Noah grew, it became clear that he was different. He was diagnosed with autism when he was 2, and soon after, doctors told us that one of his legs was shorter than the other. He would need therapy, special care, and maybe even surgery in the future. It didn't change how I felt about him. He was my son, my light, my whole world. But when my parents found out, their reaction was exactly what I feared. They called me, laughing at me.
Of course you'd give birth to an imbecile.
It's karma. You were always a disappointment, and now life gave you one in return.
I was shaking with rage. Alex grabbed the phone from me before I could respond and hung up. I blocked their numbers, but that didn't stop them. They used different numbers every time, making sure I never had peace. They'd send me pictures of disabled children with captions like, "You can relate to this now, can't you?" A burden raising a burden. How fitting. I wanted to ignore them, but every new message felt like a fresh wound. Alex told me to stop looking at them, to let it go, but how could I? These were my own parents, the people who were supposed to love me. Then, one day, they took it further. There was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. Alex went to check. The moment he opened it, I heard my mother's voice.
Let me in. How dare she block us? You can't ignore us forever, Kate. Come out here.
I felt sick. They had actually come to my home. I saw Alex blocking the doorway.
Leave us alone. We just want to see our grandchild. Personally, I'd like to see how bad his condition is. Haha.
You're so evil. Get out of here. You don't have a grandchild here. My mother tried to push past Alex, but he was way stronger than her.
Aren't you tired and ashamed of insulting my wife and my son? Get off our property before I call the cops.
They glared at us, but for once, they saw they had no power here, so they left. I never expected to see them again, not after Alex had made it clear that they weren't welcome. But one evening, the doorbell rang. I peered through the peephole, expecting another delivery or maybe a neighbor. But it was them. I almost didn't open the door. But something was different this time. They weren't smirking, weren't wearing their usual condescending expressions. Instead, they looked drained and sad. For a brief moment, I thought maybe they were here to apologize. But I should have known better. What do you want?
We need to talk. It's about Damien.
I almost laughed. Of course it was about Damien. Everything in their world revolved around him. I crossed my arms, blocking the entrance. Well, I don't care about Damien. Can you leave now?
You will care, because you're going to help him.
I laughed. But before I could shut the door, my mother's voice rang out sharp and desperate.
He's dying, Kate. Unfortunately, he got involved with drugs and got addicted. His heart and lungs are failing.
I hesitated, not because I cared about Damien, but because I was shocked. Damien had become a drug addict? Wow. And why exactly do you think that's my problem?
You really are ungrateful. After everything we did for you.
Did for me? You mean kicking me out? Mocking me for years? Calling my son an imbecile? You mean that? My mother waved her hand dismissively, as if brushing away my words.
Enough of your self-pity, Kate. Damien needs a heart and lungs.
Then get him a donor. Why are you telling me? What does that have to do with me? Do I look like a doctor to you? In case you both forget, you refused to send me to college.
Are you done yapping? Anyway, it has to do with your son, not you. Don't let yourself feel all special.
Let's be honest, Kate. That boy will never be normal. He'll never have a real life. He can't function properly, and he'll always be a burden on you. Damien, on the other hand, has a future. He's our son, our real child. And he's your brother. You should be willing to make the sacrifice.
Sacrifice? What are you talking about?
We need Noah's heart and lungs. Sacrifice your son for our son, for your brother.
I felt so disgusted immediately. They weren't asking. They were demanding. Like it was the most natural thing in the world. You want me to kill my son? I can't believe you both.
Oh, don't be dramatic. He's not useful to anyone, Kate. Damien is. The boy himself will be happy if you cut his miserable life short.
I wanted to slap them, but instead I slammed the door in their faces. They wouldn't leave me alone. Calls from unknown numbers flooded my phone.
If anything happens to Damien, it's your fault, you selfish witch. His blood will be on your hands.
I laughed at them. They thought I cared? Damien was nothing to me, just like me and my son were nothing to them. 3 months passed. No donor ever came. Damien rotted in his hospital bed until his body gave out and he passed away. My parents buried him in a grand funeral, wailing like they hadn't enabled his destruction. I didn't attend, not even a single condolence text. Then, 2 weeks later, they showed up at my doorstep again. I expected more insults, more blame. Instead, they laughed at me like they'd won something.
You lost, Kate, and you'll always lose.
Damien is gone, but his blood lives on. He got a girl pregnant before he died. Our grandchild is coming, and unlike your little imbecile, this child will be perfect.
They left after that, looking triumphant. But fate had other plans. Damien's child was born a true imbecile, worse than anything they'd mocked my son for. The baby couldn't move, drooled endlessly, and was completely unresponsive. The mother vanished, leaving my parents with the burden. And that was when they came crawling back to me. They stood outside my house, their arrogance shattered. The same people who had spat on my son now begged me to teach them how to care for their blessed grandson. I decided to play along. I pretended to forgive them, luring them in with sweet words and empty smiles. Alex had just landed a high-paying job abroad, one that came with a mansion. Before we left, I convinced my parents to sell their house and invest all their money into a business I owned, without them knowing it was mine. As a result, they became penniless and had no choice but to move into my house. I'll send you money once we settle in. You won't have to worry about a thing. They fell to their knees, thanking me like I was their savior. The next day, Alex, my son, and I boarded a plane and never looked back. By then, I was 3 months pregnant, but I never told them. I changed my number. Unknown to them, Alex had already sold the house. A week after they moved in, the new owners arrived, and my parents started hurling insults at them. The owners left, but later returned with 3 men who beat my parents and threw them onto the streets, their helpless grandson in their arms. Meanwhile, I gave birth to a healthy baby girl abroad. My son's legs were corrected through surgery at 5, allowing him to walk normally. His autism? It was mild. No one even noticed unless we told them. As for my parents, they reached their lowest 3 years later. Broke, starving, and desperate, they tried selling off their disabled grandchild. Fortunately, they were caught, arrested, and sent to jail. The government took their grandchild, but she died months later. When the inmates learned about my parents' crimes, they made their lives a living hell. My parents were nicknamed baby sellers. Inmates forced them to perform humiliating tasks for small favors, like barking like a dog just to get a piece of bread. They were assigned to clean toilets and serve other prisoners. The worst part? The guards saw everything but turned a blind eye. Serves them right. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and leave a comment down below saying, "I subscribed," and we'll do our best to reply to your comment.